You know, I was talking to a surgeon friend of mine the other day, or I was texting him, and it just blows me away. A lot of our colleagues, and I said to him, I said, when I went to nursing school, we had to take psychology 1 and 2, clinical psychology, and the only two clinical psychology experiments, or tests, or phenomena, or whatever you want to call, that I can use to explain the phenomena of what we're seeing amongst our colleagues is the Milgram experiment and the Solomon Asch conformity experiment. And I think these both were utilized later after World War II to explain some of the phenomena that we saw in Hitler's Germany, uneducated people that had gone mad, basically. And but I'm glad that Dr. Flemming and other doctors and clinicians and scientists and whatnot are truthful and honest and well read and vocal and actually see what's going on. So I share with you Dr. Flemming and his analysis of crimes against humanity and what's going on.
But I also want to make very clear that all of us should look forward to what we can get once we hit that 70% double dose. And as the roadmap that we released indicated, at 70% double dose, you will be required under the health orders to only be able to frequent venues if you're vaccinated. And I just want to make that very clear. It's black and white. If you're not vaccinated, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a cafe. At 70% double dose, everybody, every business leader, every community member should be very clear that the health orders will be saying that you cannot go and do anything on the roadmap which will be specified unless you are completely vaccinated. Everybody who is fully vaccinated at 70% will get freedoms. Let me make that very clear. If you have made the effort of getting yourself vaccinated, by the time we open up at 70%, you will be able to go and eat at a cafe, you'll be able to get your hair cut, you'll be able to do all those things we've all missed. And even though the government is saying unvaccinated people might have other rights from the 1st of December, a lot of airlines have said they won't carry anybody who's not vaccinated. A lot of businesses have said we won't welcome anyone that's unvaccinated. I want to be very clear, life for the unvaccinated will be very difficult indefinitely. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to make a public statement and won't be taking any questions. I've had to make an extremely difficult decision overnight, but one which I feel obliged to do because of the love and respect I have for the people of New South Wales and the high regard which I have for the Office of Premier. I was advised late yesterday afternoon the Independent Commission Against Corruption will today release a public statement in which it will state it is investigating allegations made about me concerning matters relating to the former member for Wagga Wagga. As it is clear from the ICAC statement, the issues which it is investigating are historic matters that have already been the subject of numerous attacks on me by political opponents in the last 12 months.
Bruh. Now comes the part where we throw our heads back and laugh. Ready? Ready!
Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Flemming. A couple of weeks ago, Alex Jones was kind enough to invite me onto his program to talk briefly about the drug vaccines for SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. Today, I want to take just a moment to give you some more in-depth information about these viruses and these vaccines, as well as some of the legal proceedings that we are pursuing in the International Criminal Court to hold the people accountable for the development of this virus and the dissemination of these vaccines. The first question to ask is, do drug vaccine biologics work? Can they work, and how? Next slide, please. You'll see here at the very beginning of 2020, go ahead and play the video, audio.
Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are 95% effective. Does this mean that if I get the vaccine, I won't get infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus?
That means that there's a 95% chance that you will not get symptomatic infection, namely that you won't get infected to the point that you get symptoms. But we are unsure right now what the protection is against infection, because it's conceivable that you could get vaccinated, get exposed, get infected, not know it because the vaccine is protecting you against symptoms, but that you could have virus in your nasopharynx, which is the reason why we say until we prove that the vaccine prevents transmission, that people who are vaccinated should wear a mask when they're near people who might be vulnerable to infection.
Early in 2020, you can back that up one slide, please. Early in 2020, this comedian who was from Mexico had an opportunity to ask Dr. Anthony Fauci about the vaccines themselves long before they were popularly used and disseminated and forced upon the US and world population. One of the big misunderstandings about vaccines is that they somehow prevent you from getting infected or spreading an infection. For a vaccine to actually work, it has to be given to a person, allow you to make an immune response, and then the only way it actually is any benefit to anybody is if you then get infected with the virus. Because it's that second infection with the real virus coming at you from person to person transfer, that's really what's being targeted. In the absence of you getting infected by somebody else with the actual virus, the vaccine has no effect except for the consequences of giving you the vaccine, all the inflammation and blood clotting that we're seeing on the VAERS adverse event sites, and all the deaths that are associated with the vaccines. Next slide, please. Now, I only have 6 basic concerns about the drug vaccines, and I'm going to briefly lay them out here for you over the next few slides. The first part is that we have always taken a virus in the past and taken every type of that virus and put it together with all of its parts, so the spike proteins and the membrane and the envelope and everything else, and then we've weakened it and injected it into people. In fact, in 2007, the Chinese did this quite successfully with SARS-CoV-1. But by taking all the different types of variants of the virus and all the parts of the virus, when you give that to someone and in a vaccine, the person develops a immune response or benefit to all of the variants and all of the parts of the virus, so that no matter which one you get exposed to, you're protected. Next slide, please. This study shows that 2007 study by the Chinese, where they took a number of they took 36 individuals, 18 men and women, all who had no problems, and they divided them into 3 groups. 2 different ones got vaccines and 1 got a placebo group. And if you look down here in the graphic, you'll see at the very beginning at 0 weeks, there was no antibody response. At 28 weeks with the second injection, the people who got the drug vaccine developed antibody responses to all of the virus of the SARS-CoV-2, not just to the spike protein, but to the spike protein and to the membrane and the envelope and everything else that makes these coronaviruses so infectious. Next slide, please. The second concern is that they've picked out one specific spike protein. This spike protein is the original one that was found in Wuhan. And so you've heard Delta virus and Mu virus and Alpha. The original virus is called SARS-CoV-2 Wuhan HU1. That's the spike protein that they targeted. And by targeting that specific spike protein, they're asking our immune systems to respond to that spike protein. Nothing else about the virus. And any spike protein that's too much different from that HU1 spike protein, the farther it gets away from that, the less likely these vaccines will have any benefit, if at all. Next slide, please. Now, this rather complicated graphic is the brilliant work of Jean-Claude Perez and other individuals who have looked at these spike proteins and the vaccines. This shows the makeup of the Wuhan HU1 spike protein. In red, the squiggly red lines show the genes that make up the spike protein, and the blue line shows the spike protein itself. Now that's important because that tells you what you're actually looking at. Next slide, please. Here is, in fact, go ahead, and I think there's some things to advance here. Here, we're going to see the actual Wuhan spike protein in the upper left-hand corner. And in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see the Moderna lipid nanoparticle vaccine, mRNA. And in the very bottom right, you're going to see the Pfizer lipid nanoparticle mRNA. And what you need to notice here is that the red lines and the blue lines of the Wuhan spike protein, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine don't match, which means that what's in those vaccines do not genetically match the Wuhan HU1 virus. So when they say they are giving us a vaccine that is the exact same thing as the virus, well, this data shows that since the red and blue lines don't match, the proteins being made and the nucleotide genetic codes are not the same as the virus. Next slide, please. The third concern is that given the evidence that we know that the genetic code of this virus and the proteins being made are not identical to the Wuhan HU1 spike protein, the next question is, what else is not quite correct about what we're being told? And the amount of immune response that we're being told that these vaccines have indicate that something else is amiss. That in fact, what we're really seeing are self-amplifying mRNA vaccines. The acronym is SAM. Next slide, please. What we see in the left half here is a conventional vaccine with A. You inject a certain genetic code into somebody, you get a certain protein response. B shows what happens when you take another piece of that genetic code that replicates the virus, which is earlier in the genetic code, and you include that in the vaccine, and you see you get more spike protein or more immune response. Now, back in March of this year, I cautioned people that it looked to me like this must be what's going on. And if, in fact, this is what's going on, that the mRNA vaccines are self-amplifying mRNA vaccines, it means that we haven't been told the truth about everything that's in these vaccines. It's critical because the funding that's been paid for, and you can see down the papers where they were published, the New England Journal of Medicine and Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, these same self-amplifying mRNAs have been associated with new types of vaccines that are called transmissible and transferable. These are studies being done to see if you can inject one person, or one, in this case, bat, and get that person to transfer to the next person the vaccine. Now, I'm not saying this is what's being done, but what I am saying is that the same people that are doing the self-amplifying mRNA research are doing these transmissible vaccine research. And why is this important? Next slide, please. Go ahead and just keep advancing those until we get to the next slide. Because if we look at the research data on self-amplifying mRNAs down here at the bottom left, and we look at the transmissible vaccines in the upper left, you'll see that the same people are funding these studies. And when you look at the bottom left, and then you look at the table on the right, you will see that they have shown in this research self-amplifying mRNA research. They've shown multiple viruses, including HIV, cytomegalovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, vaccine encephalitis virus, Zika virus, and they show what part of the protein is being made and whether it's a lipid nanoparticle. And if you look at the very top, over here, second to the right, it says what animal is being used for this research. If you go down this column, you'll see mice, pigs, sheep, rats, except at the very top. The animal model being used for SARS-CoV-2 self-amplifying mRNA research is human. Next slide, please. Third problem that I have with that is the concept that these vaccines stay at the site of injection. We're told that The injection goes in, stays in the muscle, doesn't move around in the body. And we know for a fact that this is not true. We know for a fact from the animal studies that were done, from the Moderna studies that were done with influenza virus vaccines from lipid nanoparticles in 2017, that these vaccines are found in the brain, in the bone marrow, in the heart, in the liver, and the spleen, all these organs that are being affected by these adverse drug reactions to these vaccines were shown back in 2017. It's also important to understand that when you get infected normally by a virus, it comes into your body, and before it gets into your cells, that virus is available for your immune system to respond to. Now, the first part of your immune system is called the innate, I-N-N-A-T-E, immune system. That is critical for you to be protected, not only if you acquire the infection from another person, but if you're trying to build immunity from a drug vaccine. Why? Because that is the first part that is fundamental for your body to recognize that it's being invaded. And in the process of seeing the virus, you have cells that eat that virus, tear it down, share it with other cells, and one of those other cells that are made are what's called T helper 2 cells. T helper 2 cells are critical because for antibodies to be made, the T helper 2 cells from the innate immune system have to join with the B cells, the antibody-making cells that come from the adaptive humoral immune system that's laid on top of innate. So innate has to be activated for the antibodies to work. T helper 2 has to be activated for the antibodies to really be made. Next slide, please. When lipid nanoparticle vaccines are injected, they're coated with cholesterol. So when your body sees that, it sees cholesterol. It sees lipids, lipid nanoparticle. That's not foreign to the human body, so it doesn't recognize that as being a virus invading. And instead of being outside with cells that can first eat that virus and then end up making those T helper 2 cells, it gets snuck into our cells, and our cells start making the virus or the spike proteins without our innate immune system ever been awakened to it or activated. This set of data, and you can go ahead and click next so we'll get the fill in here, you can see what happens to liver and spleen and muscle when these lipid nanoparticles are injected. In fact, this is the study from 2017 with Moderna's lipid nanoparticle influenza vaccine, and these are all the organ systems that they found the vaccines in. The brain, the bone marrow, the liver, the spleen. In fact, they found them within a matter of hours, and they lasted for 5 days in that study. So they not only don't stay where they're injected, they're there for the better part of a week. They invade all of our body parts. So when you're wondering whether it's possible for these vaccines to spread through the body, well, Moderna showed in 2017 that they do. So now when everybody is saying, wait a minute, it looks like these vaccines might spread outside of the area of injection, it's a little disingenuous to say, golly, we didn't know that, because we did in 2017. Next slide, please. So here's kind of the process. Normally, what you see on the left-hand part is a virus comes into the body, and your body recognizes it as being abnormal and begins that innate immune system with T cell response, including T helper 2 cell. Well, the lipid nanoparticles won't get picked up that way because, as we've already talked about, they sneak inside into the second part of it where your cells start making what's inside that vaccine. Potentially, the Janssen, which is typically referred to as Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or the AstraZeneca, which use an adenovirus and DNA of this SARS-CoV-2 as the vaccine, maybe that works. Well, The simple answer to that question is your innate immune system isn't seeing SARS-CoV-2 when those vaccines are used. What your innate immune system sees is an adenovirus, because that's the carrier virus taking that SARS-CoV-2 into your cells. So the innate system for the Janssen and the AstraZeneca vaccines aren't responding to a SARS-CoV-2, they're responding to an adenovirus. And last time I checked, adenovirus and SARS-CoV-2 are two different viruses. Next slide, please. Now, this is the complicated drawing showing how this entire thing works. In the upper left-hand corner, you see that a virus comes into the body, whether it be adenovirus or Novavax, which is made out of moth cells using a virus that infects the cells of moths because it won't even infect human cells. And then your immune system eats that in the upper left-hand corner and turns what's called a naive T cell into a T helper 1 cell at the lower left, and that eventually will develop and release these chemicals that cause inflammation in the body, tissue necrosis factor, interferon, which means it interferes with the virus. All of these things require this innate immune system to work. Next slide, please. And this shows what happens when the T helper 1 cells get activated. They actually then will release other chemicals, interleukin 12 and a variety of others, to make this T helper 2 cell, which is critical because this T helper 2 cell has to respond to the B cell that makes the antibodies for your body to really know that you've identified the correct virus, to increase the amount of B cells making this antibody, and to make the right type of antibody. It's also critical to know that this initial innate T cell system is responsible for what's called cytotoxic T cells in the bottom left. And these are the cells that actually go in and say, wait a minute, cells of our body infected by a virus that needs to be killed, and they kill the infected cell. Again, that's the innate system, and bypassing this is tantamount to destroying the effect of our immune system to work. Next slide, please. How do we know all of this? You can hit the next slide and it will come up with script that people can read, because real scientists and real researchers do more than say, gosh, it looks like the patients didn't develop COVID, which is what you're really being told. What we do is we measure, is there a T cell response? Is there a T helper 2 cell response? Are these chemicals being made by the vaccines? Next, go ahead and click the next part. Are antibodies actually being made in response to these drug vaccines? In fact, what you will not see in the emergency use authorizations that the FDA used to clear these vaccines is any information that shows measurements of T cells or antibody response. Next slide, please. Specific concerns with drug vaccines. Next slide, please. These drug, and you can click the next part, it's going to have some script here. How do we know what's actually happening inside the human body? We can measure the response of these T cells and B cells, or we can actually measure the tissue damage using a method that admittedly I patented called Flemming method, but has been made available for anybody who wants to use it completely free of charge. And we have already seen previously that other types of vaccines, well, in this one in particular, that they worked with mice and they showed an allergic response, impairing these T helper 2 cells that are so critical. They showed this earlier with SARS-CoV-1, and these slides for people who are science and medically oriented show a lot of these inflammatory cells building up in these mice in response to these vaccines. Next slide, please. And you can go ahead and hit next on this. Here is an example of what has been discovered with the Pfizer vaccine. You'll see the BioNTech, that's BNT. That's actually the company that makes these vaccines for Pfizer. After the second injection So you have first dose and second dose. They actually then, other people have measured what type of innate immune response occurred with tissue necrosis factor alpha and with interleukin 1 beta. And what has been shown with Pfizer vaccine is that once you inject that second injection of the Pfizer vaccine, it impairs the ability of your body to respond to influenza virus. So it's interfering not only with the production of T helper 2 cells, but it's interfering with your then response if you get exposed to influenza. Next slide, please. Go ahead and click the material. This is an example of the Pfizer vaccine actually showing measured reductions in our T cells after you get vaccinated. So this study was done and published in Nature in 2020, again using the Pfizer vaccine. And you can see here the count of the lymphocytes, the T cells, actually goes down following the initial injection with the Pfizer vaccine. Now, it doesn't go down as much later on, but it certainly doesn't go up. Next slide, please. This is a rhesus study, rhesus monkey study, using the Moderna vaccine. And what this study clearly showed, that was published in New England Journal of Medicine, is that when they looked at the memory CD4 cells, the T helper 2 response in number B with the red circle, there is no T helper 2 cell response using the Moderna vaccine. So there is no complete innate response, and these cells are the ones critical for antibody production. Next slide, please. You've heard a lot of question about whether vaccines or natural immunity provide a better response. Well, this study, or these studies, actually showed, two different studies in biomedicine and scientific reports, shows what happens when you get natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2. In fact, it shows not only the IgG antibody to the far left, but in C, you'll see the IgA antibody. And that's critical, and you don't hear anybody talking about that. But IgA antibody is the antibody that needs to be made if your lungs are infected or your GI tract. And this is a virus that infects our lungs and GI tract. So you should ask the question, where's all the IgA data on the drug vaccines? Well, it's not there, but you can see person-to-person transfer natural immunity. There is an IgA response. And in fact, you can also see here, you can go ahead and, I think there's more wording up here, but the T cell response that we're concerned about that isn't happening with these drug vaccines, if you've had influenza or you've had cytomegalovirus, you may already have immunity to SARS-CoV-2, as this latter part showed with these individuals that had previously been exposed to influenza or cytomegalovirus already had an immune response mounted to SARS-CoV-2. Next slide, please. My fifth point of concern is that the EUAs show no statistical reduction in COVID cases. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to walk you through this. Hit next, please. There we go. The way vaccine efficacy is determined, all this 95 and 85 and 67% numbers that you hear, is done as follows. It's a ratio of the number of people that get diagnosed with COVID who get the vaccine. Go ahead and click next. 8 over divided by the number of people, and I see that we have Greek script, but this is the number of people. Now hit the next component. This is the difference between Keynote and PowerPoint translation. So the number of people who end up with COVID who didn't get vaccinated, next. And in the example of Pfizer, they talked about 8 in the vaccinated group coming down with the diagnosis of COVID versus 162 in the non-vaccinated group, next. Oh, back one, please. My apologies. Which gave a ratio of 0.05 risk ratio. 1 minus the risk ratio tells you that vaccine efficacy. So what they did is they asked how many people were diagnosed. Next slide, please. But that's not really the question you need to be asking. You need to be asking, is there a difference between people that are vaccinated and unvaccinated, and what that difference really is? And so you can look at the relative risk reduction. You can look at the more critical absolute risk reduction, the difference between groups. And you can look at the numbers of people you need to vaccinate to see the difference of just one. Next slide, please. And hit next, next, next. There we go. Now, how was the diagnosis of COVID made in these vaccine studies? Well, pretty much the same way as it's done in normal life. It's a positive PCR test, whether you got vaccinated or not, and do you have symptoms? Well, if you look at the list of symptoms under Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, you'll see that these symptoms match just about any infection, whether it's SARS-CoV-2 or influenza or cytomegalovirus or respiratory syncytial virus or the common cold or cancer or bacterial infection. These are all the same symptoms. So this is not a very good way to determine whether it really worked, but level the playing field. This was the rules they had. So let's see what the data really shows. Next slide, please. Here's a look at the Pfizer vaccine. Next. Confirmed COVID-19 cases in the emergency use authorization document published by Pfizer. Next. They found 8 people that got vaccinated. That's why we went through this before. Click next, which gives you 8 in the numerator. Next, please. In the placebo group, the folks who didn't get any vaccine, there were 162. Now, you're going to look at that first and say, wow, 8 versus 162. Next. There's the 162. Click next, please. 0.05, next, gives you 95% efficacy. Next slide. Well, here's what the data really shows when you dig into it. You can either ask how many got it, or you can ask how many people did not get COVID. You can look for the absolute risk reduction, and that's what we're going to do here. That same 8 shows up here, and if you take 8 from the 17,700 or 17,411 people that were actually getting the vaccine, that means 17,403 of the Pfizer group did not get COVID, and that's 0.05%. The non-vaccinated group, turns out that there were 17,511 people in the non-vaccine group, of which 17,349 did not get diagnosed with COVID. That's a ratio of 0.93%. And if you do the math, if you look at this statistically, like a scientist like I look at it, and you say, are these different numbers really meaningful? Or do they just kind of give the impression of it? We statistically analyze it. And when you do that, you will see in the bottom right in white, not significant at p less than 0.05. That means the result of this study shows no statistical reduction in the number of COVID cases between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. No difference. And the absolute risk reduction was 0.88%, not 95%. The difference between the groups was 0.88%. Next slide, please. And if you look at the number of deaths in the Pfizer group, there wasn't any difference between those who were vaccinated and not. In fact, it very specifically states all deaths represent events that occur in the general population of the age groups where they occurred at a similar rate. So no difference statistically in reductions of COVID cases, and no difference in the number of deaths for Pfizer. Next slide, please. Now that we've done that, we can move a little faster with the same approach. We see for the Moderna group, if you look at the bottom, there were 13,934 people who were in the Moderna vaccine group. 13,923 did not get COVID. That meant 11 did. I give you a value of 0.08%. In the non-vaccinated group, there were 13,883 people. 13,698 did not get COVID. If you look at those two groups and you ask, are they different? It turns out that they are not statistically different. And if you look at the absolute risk reduction, it's 1.25%. Next slide, please. If you look at the Moderna group and you say, was there a difference in deaths? There's no statistically significant difference in the numbers of deaths between the two groups, and they represent what you normally expect to see in the population. No statistical reduction in COVID, no statistical reduction in deaths. Next slide, please. This is Janssen. Janssen got a little bit more sophisticated with what they did. They reported both at 14 days and 28. So this slide looks at the 14-day data. And remember that Janssen is a single injection. So they looked at 14 days after that single injection. Janssen had 21,636 in that group. 21,460 did not end up with COVID. The non-vaccinated group had 21,574. 21,061 did not end up with COVID. And when you looked at that, the p-value was significant. There was a statistically significant difference in the people who did not come down with COVID if they got the Janssen vaccine at 14 days. Next slide, please. However, when you go out 2 more weeks, 28 days, and you do the same numbers for those groups, that difference disappeared. So it was good if you were looking for a difference at 14 days, 2 weeks, but you go out to 4 weeks, and that difference is completely gone. Next slide, please. And because of all the items that Janssen did, they were taking data that wasn't confirmed by their central core lab. And if we compare the non-centrally confirmed results to the centrally confirmed next, with eliminating the mild cases next, what happens is you see these numbers in the top row of 176 and 513 start to drop to 117 and 351 cases. You see the number of people diagnosed with COVID dramatically drop when the central core had to confirm whether everybody was right or not. And next, there was a 32 to 42% drop in the number of COVID cases just by virtue of making sure that the central lab agreed. Next slide, please. This is the deaths associated with COVID, or with the Janssen vaccine. There was no statistical reduction in the differences, and the vast majority of people that were reportedly dead that they diagnosed with, they didn't even know if it was COVID. 7 out of the 20 in the non-vaccine group, they didn't know what the cause was. It wasn't defined as COVID. Next slide, please. But what we do know is that Janssen admitted, at least right up front, all the neurologic damage that was caused by the vaccine. And you can see laid out here, blood clots, ringing in the ears, convulsions, all the stuff you're seeing on social media is exactly what was reported in the EUA documents. And yet, despite showing that at 28 days there was no benefit to this vaccine compared to not being vaccinated, no reduction in COVID cases, no reduction in deaths, but the problems with blood clotting and convulsions and neurologic damage, the EUAs still passed the FDA. Next slide, please. Amazingly enough, in all 3 EUA documents, it was very clear. There is no data to show that anybody who has responded to the virus and recovered with natural immunity has any benefit by being vaccinated by any of the 3 vaccines that the FDA has given EUA approval for. Next slide, please. In fact, if you take the absolute risk reduction and you look at the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Gamaleya, that's the Russian one, the Janssen, the AstraZeneca, you'll see that the numbers aren't 95% or 90% or 67%. The absolute risk reduction goes from 0.84 to 1.3%. The real elephant in the room is what's the difference between the groups, and it turns out statistically, nothing. Next slide, please. So why did I put you through all those slides? Go ahead and just run that through. So you could do the scientific review that the FDA didn't. Next. Based upon the EUA documents, next, there's no statistical reduction in COVID rates, no statistical reduction in COVID death rates. There is an unacceptable VAERS death and adverse event rate that we're constantly seeing updated. Next. Next, please. the absolute risk reduction was actually 0.8 to 1.3%, not these higher numbers. Why did we go through the slides? Next. To provide you with answers you need, so when somebody says there's a benefit of getting the vaccines, you've seen the actual data submitted to the FDA by these drug companies for these emergency use authorization documents showing there's no statistical reduction in COVID cases or deaths, but there are substantial adverse effects. Next. Because the FDA basically failed to do its job. They failed to provide the scientific, ask the questions that scientists should ask. Next. Now here's the VAERS adverse death data. That's back in November of 2021. In April, you can see these numbers increase. It doesn't matter whether we're looking at adverse events, deaths, or serious injuries. Next, please. The numbers jump. If we just look at deaths, they go from 2,600 to 3,500 to by 7th of May, 4,000. Next. To the 23rd of August, next 13,000, the 3rd of September, 14,000. That's just in the United States. And that's not counting the adverse effects on the heart, the 5,000 to 6,000 have been documented, or any other harm. You know, if these drug vaccines were actually demonstrating a statistical reduction in COVID or deaths, you could start to make an argument for why you might have to tolerate the side effects. The problem is the documents don't support that. The documents don't show a statistical reduction in COVID or deaths, but we are seeing massive numbers of disease. And look at the deaths. It doesn't matter whether it's 14,000 or 45,000. We stopped the swine flu vaccine in the mid-1970s because of 25 deaths. Next slide, please. This is what we can see from the European Data Bank. Next slide. Hit several of them here until you see all those pop up. Next. There we go. At least one dose of COVID. And you can see next the number of reported adverse events in Europe back in May was almost 500,000. Next. With more than 600,000 serious injuries. Next. Almost 1,200 multiple symptoms and deaths in Europe by May was 12,000. Added to what we have. Next slide, please. And finally, the sixth thing. The mass vaccination program has produced what's called pressure selection of these viruses. So let's take a look at this. Next slide, please. They've talked about the Delta variant as if it's something unique. I want you to look around, each and every one of you, look at the people next to you, and realize that every one of you are a different variant of human. But you're all there, and these viruses have the same thing. They have variants. There's more than one type of them, and as I said at the very beginning, in 2007, and always before with vaccines, we've taken every variant with all of its parts, weakened it, and made antibodies for immune responses so that you would see everything. But in this case, we only included the genetic material for Wuhan HU1. So you can see on the far left, there's been the alpha, the beta, the gamma, the delta, there's kappa. You're hearing about mu right now. These are all the variants. They each have little variations. And the farther these variations get from the original Wuhan HU1, the less recognized it's going to be by these vaccines. In fact, Pfizer was so concerned that about 2 to 3 weeks ago, they announced that when these breakthroughs occur, so that the vaccines no longer work, within 91 days, they can gear up a new vaccine, which they will then need to inject into you to bring under control the next scare of the next variant that they produce. Next slide, please. This is Alpha 1. This was actually what broke through in England originally that caused all this stress, and you can see all these colored areas or the variances in the spike protein of the alpha variant of SARS-CoV-2 compared to the HU1 variant. Next slide, please. Back that up one, please. If you look at the very bottom, I want you to look at this site. You can go to this site and you can get all of this information if you really want to. That should be the topic of what everybody's talking about when they're having press releases from the federal government or HHS or NIAID or whomever, because these investigators, Doctors Emma Hodcroft and Luc Montagnier and Jean-Claude Perez, have been working diligently on getting the information about what's really in these viruses. Next slide, please. We're going to look at, real quick, 33 countries, and we're going to look at the different vaccines when they occurred, and what you will see is that all this is color-coded, and the consistent theme here is that every time a new drug vaccine was added, be it Pfizer and P, AstraZeneca and AZ, the Moderna, or the Janssen and J, drop the line down to where it got started, and you will see in the UK, the US, Germany, Sweden, and the like, you will see an increase in number of COVID cases and SARS infections, and a pressure selection pushing away from the HU1 to the variants that are less like what's in the vaccine, in this case, the Delta variant. So you can see the Delta variant being shown in the green here, popping up at the end of this. This was in June of 2021. Next slide, please. Here's what happens in these countries, and in Spain and Belgium. You can see what happened in India. You stop treating people with drugs that work, and you start giving them vaccines that put pressure selection on the virus, and this is the disaster you end up with. You can see what happened in Mexico, and they have used all 8 of them, including Covaxin, CanSino, Camela, and the Sinovac ones. Next slide, please. Same concept here. There's a lot of countries without data, but Croatia, Australia show the same phenomena. Next slide, please. And this brings us to a few other countries, along with Israel. As most people know, Israel went full throttle, committed to the Pfizer vaccine, and vaccinated the vast majority of its population. By June of 2021, Israel was saying they had successfully defeated the virus, but because it puts this pressure selection, it selects out for anything further away from the HU1. A month later, Delta is rearing its ugly head in Israel, despite most everybody being vaccinated. And you can see that with the green pop-up here in Israel showing the Delta variant. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to walk you through here step by step, because these are all the variants on the bottom. And if you look down here to the Delta, I want you to watch how this wave appears. Next, please. This is Pfizer. Next. That's when it was started. Moderna, next. Next ones. You can see as these drug vaccines got added, what happened was an increase in cases and a shift from one variant to another, as we have seen finally with the last one, the Delta variant being pushed across. This tells you the sequence of changes and pressure selection for this Delta variant and now mu to occur as the direct result of these drug vaccines. Next slide, please. This shows you Delta. It shows you a 2-fold increase in its ability to get away from responding to the vaccines. This is the Delta variant. Next slide, please. Here's what the Israeli data really looks like. This is what happened back in May and June when they thought they had a handle on it. And by August, you can see that the variants are popping up. In fact, by the 15th of August, they had 514 Israelis hospitalized. And when people tell you this is a phenomenon of unvaccinated people, 59% of the people admitted with the Delta variant were vaccinated, and 87% of those were in people over age 60. Vaccination and the age increase, and we're calling for a booster shot in the United States. Next slide, please. Here's all the different variants that occur. This is what mu looks like, so you can see all the color changes of the spike protein that's different. And all of this on the left is actually how we compare these different variants. This on the right shows the subtle changes that are occurring, and you can see exactly where they are, and you can see the overlap. So it's not like these viruses are completely different, but there's a lot of similarities, just which one of these bases and variants are there. Next slide, please. Which brings us to what we're really doing. We're doing vaccine chasing, and the phenomenon is really that you're getting a lot of misinformation provided to you, and every time there's misinformation, it's like somebody saying squirrel, and your attention is darted there, and this is what happens.
Did that dog just say hi there?
Oh, yes.
Bruh!
My name is Doug. I have just met you, and I love you. My master made me this collar. He is a good and smart master, and he made me this collar so that I may talk. Squirrel!
And that's all it takes. We're just about there. And This is a dog chasing its tail, and the irony of this dog chasing its tail that we'll just do the video of is that it's guarding its carrot, and it's so concentrated on the distraction. Watch what happens. This is vaccine chasing. And while it's chasing its tail, it can't figure out quite what happened. Vaccine chasing is the phenomenon of chasing based upon a single spike protein or a single part of this virus, producing pressure selection, producing these variants that everybody is now complaining is a result of the unvaccinated, when in fact it's the direct result of the vaccination sequence. And with that, I'm going to call a brief break, and we will come back to you in just a moment to discuss crimes against humanity. Welcome back. In the last segment, I talked to you briefly about my concerns about the vaccines, and I wanted to make certain that we touched on one further topic before we move on to addressing how to deal with these individuals responsible for this virus and these vaccines. Antibody-dependent enhancement is a term that you have undoubtedly heard about, and if not, I want to take a moment to make you aware of it. In the past, antibody-dependent enhancement has been that when you make antibodies to something, it causes further inflammation and blood clotting to occur in your body. The ability to make antibodies is not always a good thing. Cardiologists like myself have for years, when you've had strep throat, given you antibodies or given you antibiotics to prevent you from making antibodies. Well, why would we do that? And the truth is that the antibodies that are made to strep throat can also misinterpret the valves of your heart, your mitral valve and your aortic valve, as being the bacteria. And when that happens, those antibodies then attack the valves of your heart, producing rheumatic heart disease, which later in life can lead to heart problems and the need for valve replacement. The physicians in Osaka, Japan in 2020 demonstrated a new phenomenon for antibody-dependent enhancement. The spike protein of this coronavirus has more than one part, as you've seen in previous discussions that we've had. And one part of it is called the N-terminal domain, which is where nitrogen sits in the chemical structure, hence N-terminal domain. When antibodies are made to that part of the spike protein, the Osaka, Japan physicians in 2020 showed that those antibodies then cause the spike protein to open up and make the spike protein 4 to 10 times as infectious. In addition to causing the inflammation and blood clotting, the very antibodies that were trying to kill the virus were increasing its infectivity. Early on, you may remember, or in about the middle of 2020, people receiving convalescent plasma from people who had survived, or patients in the hospital that weren't doing so well even though they had antibodies. The reason for those bad outcomes turns out to be antibodies made to the N-terminal domain. And since bringing the spike protein into your body causes you to make antibodies not only to that regional binding domain to try to prevent attachment of the spike protein, but also the N-terminal domain, not only the virus but the vaccines have shown antibody-dependent enhancement. In fact, in a recent report put out by the Joint Artificial Intelligence of the U.S. Department of Defense, who should know something about this since the DoD was involved in the funding of the research for this gain-of-function bioweapon, they're noting that individuals over 65 were getting less and less benefit to Delta variant and other types of variants produced as a result of these drug vaccines, putting pressure selection on the actual viruses that exist. This document, I know Alex Jones has talked to you about, and Mike Adams of Natural News published it. It's an InfoWars talking about this antibody-dependent enhancement phenomenon. This information is available for people, but only if you get to the right sources. The question is, why aren't you hearing about this from mainstream media? If somebody's spreading misinformation, the easiest way to shut them down is to let them keep talking. If somebody's spreading correct information, the best way to shut them down is to shut them down. In this next section, I'd like to talk to you about what we should be doing to address these individuals responsible for the development of this gain-of-function bioweapon, SARS-CoV-2, and the vaccines that include that same genetic code, thus making them biological weapons themselves. Next slide, please. Crimes against humanity is a term that many people banter around, and they've used even for recently the disputes between who's allowing which drugs to be used and which ones aren't. But crimes against humanity are exactly that. Crimes against humanity, causing systematic campaigns against people, causing death or large-scale destruction. Next slide, please. A biological weapon, and the United States has signed and ratified the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty, is the development of a biological organism that has no benefit for mankind. And it, under all circumstances, has been excluded and not allowed by any country. To sign the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty and then to develop a virus with gain of function that causes this type of harm is not to make a peaceful weapon or a good weapon. It violates this treaty, which makes those responsible criminals. Next slide, please. In 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty was signed, and I want you to simply see this is what the document looked like. Next slide. And these are the countries that have signed on it and ratified it. And in fact, that includes the United States of America. So any involvement by US citizens of the development of a gain-of-function bioweapon is a violation of an international treaty. And under the US Constitution, the law of the United States that is supreme is the US Constitution, treaty law, and statutes or legislation passed by Congress. If you're a member of the US elected officials or appointed to an office and you've taken an oath of, to serve and protect the Constitution of the United States, and you've been involved in this, you have violated your oath, and by definition, you have committed treason. Next slide, please. To hold these people accountable requires that we go back and look at history. In the 1930s and 1940s, Nazi Germany and its leaders felt that they were above reproach. They could do whatever they wanted to do, and no one would hold them accountable. In fact, at the beginning of World War II, nobody did. But after World War II, and in 1947, these individuals were brought to justice in criminal courts. Next slide, please. For 24 defendants in the first trial for crimes of conspiracy, crimes against the peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And you can see down here at the bottom to the far left, next to the military patrol, that's Goering, number one in command of Nazi Germany after Hitler's death. Next slide, please. Goering made a very daring statement during his trial. He said that any country can get its people to do whatever they want as long as they determine that there's a problem, that there's a solution to the problem, and that anybody who stands against doing what the government tells you to do is guilty of conspiracy or being a terrorist to the country. Next slide, please. This shows what happens when these individuals are brought to accountability. In 1947, 24 defendants, Hitler killed himself and Goebbels committed suicide before being held accountable. But these are all the people that were held in the first trial. Next slide, please. There were 12 death sentences, 3 life imprisonments, and 4 sentenced to 10 to 20 years. But there were additional trials that followed that, and I want people to pay attention. Because in addition to holding the government leaders accountable, the following trials were the doctor's trial, the judge's trial, and numerous other trials that held elected officials, judges, and doctors accountable for their crimes against humanity. Next slide, please. In fact, most of you will remember this gentleman, or you've heard about him, Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was an average German individual. This is him riding a bicycle, and these are the people in the ghettos of concentration camps. Dr. Mengele thought that everything he did was for the benefit of the German people. So it didn't matter if you experimented on other people. What they were doing was right for the German people. And the first people that were imprisoned, by the way, were the PhDs and the doctorates that could disseminate information, then the Jews, and then other less desirable individuals. Remove discussion, remove debate, and you remove the problem. Again, if somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, the easiest way to let them embarrass themselves or make them non-existent is to let them keep talking. They'll show just how foolish they are. The problem is that when you have people that are talking and they're telling you the truth, the only way you can deal with them is to silence them. Try to harass them, put them in concentration camps, call them conspiracy theorists or something worse, traitors, any of a number of things. Next slide, please. The doctor's trial had significance because there wasn't a set of code for doctors to follow prior to Nuremberg. And the reason why the Nuremberg Code is so critical was because in listening to the Nazi doctors, they believed that they were innocent of any wrong, that they had the right to experiment and do whatever they wanted to on people. They were doing it for the betterment of Germany, after all. And they said, if you looked at the record, that it wasn't anything really worse than what the Americans were doing or the British were doing or other people were doing. The problem with that statement is that they were very correct in that statement. What we were doing in this country, we have atrocities longer than you could imagine, and we've continued to do that. Tuskegee experiments, syphilis experiments, radiation experiments in our military, and now we have this new experimental project that we're doing. So the 1947 Nuremberg Code, and this is what it looks like at the very front, established criteria from other doctors that said, it might be what has been done, but it is wrong to experiment on people, and you do not experiment on people without informed consent. And a mandate for a vaccine without informed consent, which means you have the right to refuse it, is a violation of all the treaties that we have signed that require that patients have informed consent. Next slide, please. Violation of the Nuremberg Code, you can see several different components here. Again, I put this here because you can watch it, you can stop it, you can read through it. I want you to see these are real documents, not something that somebody has talked about. Alex Jones and other people constantly hold up real documents for you to see so that you know there's a validity in what's being talked about. It's not just an idea. The documents are truly there, and you can genuinely see and go read it for yourself and go look for it. At your leisure, take the time to go through it that you need to. Next slide, please. The British Medical Journal, and the adjustments here, discussed the crimes against humanity most recently in 1996 and dating back to the 1949 documents. Next slide, please. It recognizes that experimentation on human beings must be done with informed consent, and some experiments simply cannot be done. There is not a betterment to humanity. There is not a treatment of disease. It's a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. It's a violation of treaty laws. Next slide, please. More on the Nuremberg Code. This goes through the voluntary consent of human subject was number 1. You can see 2 through 10, all the other 10 components of the Nuremberg Code. Next slide, please. Go ahead and play that, please.
Taking their places in the famous Nuremberg courtroom, judges of the Allied Military Tribunal begin the trial of minor war criminals.
I just put that.
In the dock, once occupied by their leaders, are 23 Nazi doctors accused of many crimes in hospitals, concentration camps, and research centers. Number 1 defendant is Karl Brandt, formerly Hitler's personal physician and a general in the Waffen-SS. Next in importance is Siegfried Handlöser, a former medical chief of the Wehrmacht. Hertha Oberhauser, the only woman defendant, was a physician in the notorious camp at Ravensbrück. All the accused pleaded not guilty, but time and evidence alone will decide their future.
Next slide, please. 16 of the doctors were eventually found guilty, and 7 of them were executed. It is not possible for physicians and those individuals that are involved with these experimental vaccines to remain completely unaccountable to Americans and to the world for the crimes that they've committed against humanity. Next slide, please. It's also a violation of the American Medical Code, American Medical Association Code of Ethics, to do something to a patient without informed consent. So it's unconscionable at this point in time that the AMA or any agency in the United States would put pressure on its physicians to force them to make their patients get vaccinated. In fact, a recommendation from your doctor to get vaccinated is fine. I have no problem with it. That's between you and your doctor. The problem, as I asked somebody a couple weeks ago in a conference, is that as a cardiologist, I've frequently looked at people who are smoking and I've said, you shouldn't do that. It's bad for your health. And nobody who wanted to continue to smoke seemed to have a problem saying, Dr. Flemming, I'm going to continue smoking. Don't keep harassing me about that. So the question is, why isn't that where the conversation ends with drug vaccines for this virus when doctors tell you, for whatever reason, you need to get a vaccine? This information you're getting allows you to make an informed, intelligent decision, and you should be able to then look at your doctor and say, I have made an informed decision, and it's not to get the vaccine, if that's what you choose. That's between you and your doctor. Next slide, please. To make an informed consent, you actually have to know what the benefits and the risks of what you're doing to the patient is. Now, I showed in the last segment the emergency use authorization documents showed no statistical reduction in COVID or deaths, even though there were concerns about inflammation and blood clotting. This on the left, if you look at this, this is a picture of the 3 package inserts of the Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen package inserts laid side by side with a picture taken over the top. There is nothing on these package inserts. They are left intentionally blank, as the documents say. So left intentionally blank, there is no material for a doctor to obtain knowledge about what the consequences or the benefits of these drug vaccines are. If you're a doctor actually telling your patients they should get these drug vaccines and you have not read the emergency use authorization documents, which are available on FlemmingMethod.com under the documents for this virus, if you've not read the emergency use authorization documents and you're telling patients that they need it or will benefit from it, then you're doing it on hearsay, what somebody else has told you, not what you have done as a physician or a scientist to carry through on your obligations to inform your patient, to provide informed consent, to provide your medical obligation to your patients. Remembering that 3-letter agencies, HHS, FDA, NIH, CDC, aren't there with you when you're seeing your patients who've been admitted either for the infection or COVID or a vaccine complication. And understand, there is no CPT code, no computer code to put into the computer by doctors that says patient had an adverse effect to one of these COVID vaccines. There is for measles, mumps, and rubella. There is for diphtheria, tetanus. There is for all the other vaccines, but there's no computer record of adverse events to a COVID vaccine. So when we go back in history, in the future, and we look back in history for the data, it's not going to be there. Next slide, please. This is the principles of Helsinki, the Declaration of Helsinki, which was another declaration of how patients should be treated. It's critical for any research drugs to be used for people to understand informed consent for patients. Next slide, please. This is more of the Declaration of Helsinki that you're welcome to stop and look at. And you can see at the very end, informed consent. Participation by individuals capable of giving informed consent as subjects in medical research must be voluntary. A mandate is not voluntary, Mr. President. Making it mandatory is a violation of informed consent. Violating informed consent violates these treaties that I just showed you. And a violation of those treaties is a violation of the oath taken to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. Next slide. More on the Declaration of Helsinki. More on these are the Hippocratic Oaths. And for those of you who think do no harm is in our oaths, it's not. It's not. But there's also not something that says to harm. These oaths that are taken by physicians like myself, either the Hippocratic Oath or my physician's oath, this was mine that I declared, is to our patients. Not to the federal government, not to elected officials, not to judges, not to big pharma, not to insurance company. These are oaths we make to our colleagues who have trained us and to our patients. This is an oath that dates back thousands of years, predating any laws or any society that currently exists. Next slide, please. This is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Treaty. Again, informed consent is a requirement. The U.S. is a signatory and ratifier of this. To make mandatory these vaccines violates this treaty. And that's treason. Next slide, please. More information on the Covenant ICCPR. Next slide, please. As is this. Next slide. After the prosecution of the criminals who ran the Nazi Germany itself and the doctors who carried out experimentation and the atrocities upon the people of Germany and other countries, came the trials of the judges that made it possible for these atrocities to occur in Nazi Germany. Judges. The judges of Nazi Germany thought they were immune to prosecution and to being held accountable. They were wrong. The judges that make decisions today will be held accountable, as will the doctors and leaders. They'll not only be held accountable by the people and public opinion, by your children and your grandchildren, but by international law, either through the International Criminal Court or another court that will be assembled should that be necessary. Next slide, please. These are the judges that were tried in the Nuremberg cases. Next slide. Crimes of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity. These are the charges for the people that have developed this gain-of-function bioweapon, that have blocked physicians from treating patients with medications that have been proven, from the development of these biological vaccines and the forced coercive mandating of people being vaccinated. For people who've been vaccinated, I completely understand. This is not an easy topic area. And you were told that for the threat that you pose to the loved ones in your life, your children, your grandparents, the lady down the block with cancer, or the guy down the block with prostate cancer, or the people that you didn't want to harm when you came into contact. You were told that this was necessary for you as a citizen to protect these people. So you stood up. You did what you were told. But this information, as you've seen, isn't validated by the emergency use authorization documents. It's not even validated by Dr. Fauci's own words when he was asked by the comedian in March of 2021 whether these vaccines prevent you from getting infected. They do not, and they do not prevent you from transmitting it. They are designed to minimize your symptoms when you get infected. That has always been the role of vaccines. It continues to be the role of these vaccines. These violations with interference of practice of medicine, prohibiting doctors from treating you. Next slide, please. These violate the 1947 Nuremberg Code, the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, the 1976 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the American Medical Code of Ethics, and medical code of ethics that are in other countries. Earlier this year, 4 countries joined a filing or requested a joining of filing with the International Criminal Court to have their cases considered together. The United Kingdom, France, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. I'm honored to say that I joined Drs. Kevin McCarran and Luc Montagnier to provide affidavits of evidence in support of calling for crimes against humanity. A couple weeks ago, on the 20th of September, We for Humanity, a group of people that are former Nazi concentration camp survivors, hand-walked this letter to the International Criminal Court, asking for the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to take this joint case to begin investigation of these perpetrators. On FlemingMethod.com, under the new or hot button, you will see, if you scroll down, a document that I posted on the 29th of September asking for everybody to sign a petition to submit to the International Criminal Court to follow up with a request for the ICC to join these cases, to begin the investigation and prosecution of these individuals, to take the affidavits that Montagnier, McCarran, and myself provided, and the letter from the Nazi concentration camp survivors. We are calling upon you, I am calling upon you to go and sign this document. It's electronic, so we can submit that for further recognition for the court to take this seriously. This is not a problem that's going to go away. There's not some cavalry somewhere else. You are the cavalry. Your signature will add to the voices calling out for justice in International Criminal Court to hold these people accountable. And anybody who wonders whether U.S. citizens can be held accountable for this or not hasn't reflected on Nazi Germany. The Nazi German political government, doctors and judges all thought they were immune, all because they thought that they had not agreed to participate in this. History proved them wrong, and history will prove these criminals wrong as well. Next slide, please. An example of a judge that may be under consideration. This judge required that individuals who were being considered for sentences had to be vaccinated. This is a forced vaccination of these individuals. This is something that will be considered in these criminal trials. Next slide, please. Loss of personal liberties, income. The world has been massively affected. We are still in something of a lockdown. We are still in something of people being afraid. We are still being called criminals for having the interest of the country and for people having a right to their individual liberties and to be able to make their own medical decisions. Cruzen was a case out of Missouri with the Department of Health where the Supreme Court of the United States stated that an American citizen may not be forced to take a treatment. That is the Supreme Court of the United States. A forced vaccine violates what the Supreme Court has said. Next slide, please. These crimes, and this goes through a list of all these different components. Next slide, please, for you to see. This is the joint case. This is the numbers for you to see for the UK, Slovakia, French, and Czech Republic, with other countries telling us that they are interested in participating in this court. Next slide, please. And this is my particular document provided, and you can see who I have asked to be individually investigated and prosecuted in the documents that I submitted to the ICC, and this is not an all-inclusive list by any means. Next slide, please. This is the letter. You can see Nazi concentration camp survivors. Next slide. I want you to understand the severity of what we are dealing with. These three brave individuals survived being in a Nazi concentration camp. They have colleagues who wanted to sign this document, but were afraid of retaliation should they sign it, including one who is a personal friend of Anne Frank. To say that there is not something amiss on this planet when survivors of Nazi concentration camps are afraid to come forward speaks volumes about what's really going on with this virus. Next slide, please. And we may not have ratified it, but that doesn't mean people in the United States cannot be held accountable by the ICC and that something can't be done to punish them for their crimes. Next slide, please. Together, we're going to prove that Hermann Wilhelm Goering was wrong, or we're going to prove to our children that we didn't care about what type of future we left for them and their children. Next slide, please. As that last slide showed, go back for me, please. If you ever wondered what you would have done in 1930s Germany, I want you to merely now look at what you are deciding that you're willing to do and what others have done, and you will then know what you would have done in 1930s and 1940s Germany. Next slide, please. It does not take a majority to prevail. We don't need everybody, but rather a tireless, irate minority keen to set brush fires in people's minds. This is how a civilized society, intelligently educated with facts, discuss things. In an open and free society, you discuss things. Freedom of speech is a discussion. Medicine and science has always exchanged ideas. It has never been one-sided. The exchange of ideas and information is critical to understanding a problem and to knowing who's causing a problem and to solving a problem. Next slide, please. These are all books that are available should you want them. Is COVID-19 a bioweapon? A scientific and forensic investigation not only details who paid for these viruses as gain of function and what they did, the published papers, the research. It includes Dr. Yan, a personal expert who was in Hong Kong, who's been involved with these Chinese scientists, who've been involved with the research from the United States. This is critical information for you to have. And is COVID-19 a bioweapon was actually submitted as evidence with the affidavits to hold these criminals accountable. Next slide, please. That's the book. It's available for you. It lays out the detail. You can see it has the endorsement of Jean-Claude Perez, of attorneys Melinda May. It has a couple other Kara, who's from the UK, and a number of other individuals have endorsed the book for the information to provide you knowledge base. You can take it, you can look at it, you can see the data for yourself. If this is not the truth, then you will have to explain to me why these federal documents exist, why these papers have been published, why these patents have been provided, and why the paper trail is so clear and concise about who's been involved. Senator Dr. Rand Paul asked Dr. Anthony Fauci a very clear set of questions. Has the NIH and NIAID been involved in gain-of-function research? And the movement lateral is very clear. He knew about it. He was involved in the funding of it. He's not the only one. Collins was involved with NIH. And the people that sit there and question an elected physician in Congress who knows what he's talking about, bringing the evidence forward, and then telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about, is either committing perjury or has something else going on that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. These are ways to get a hold of me, or at least information that you can see. Next slide, please. I want to thank Alex Jones for inviting me to present this material. I know a lot of it is material that at first glance seems overwhelming, but the truth of the matter is everybody out there watching this has the intelligence and the ability to use common sense and to read this information and answer the questions for themselves. In an intelligent, enlightened, free society, that's what we do. I make this information available for you so that you can read it at your own pace, so you can make decisions, so you can call for these people to be held accountable, so you can join the cause of being an American. I talk with people all over the world in other countries, physicians and scientists who are worried, and their one recurring question they have to me is, what are the people in the United States going to do about it? The answer comes from you, not from me or Alex Jones. It comes from what you do now, the decisions you make. You are the cavalry, you are responsible, and you are part of history. Your children and your grandchildren will judge you for the world that you leave them. Today is an opportunity to make a difference in the world. It's been my pleasure to provide this information. I want to thank Alex Jones for inviting me here. Thank you, and good day.